makes these killers in particular any different from all of the others? Why are they still the center of attention in 2022? And besides that, why are the killers even in the spotlight instead of the victims? Let's dive in and find out, shall we? Here I was, looking for a case to cover that you would be interested in watching, So I did a little research, and lo and behold, whose names popped up as the most searched serial killers in the US in the last 12 months? Well, you saw the thumbnail. People just can't seem to get enough of Bundy, Dahmer, and Ramirez. They have somehow fascinated the crowds for years now. So many movies were made about them or inspired by them. Books, streaming shows, videos, merch items, artworks, people went as far as getting them tattooed on their skin. Their personal items and anything they've written, created, or even touched can be purchased online as murderabilia for hundreds, even thousands of dollars. The question of our macabre or morbid curiosity is nothing new. For centuries and all over the world, people have gathered in crowds to get a closer look at unfortunate accidents. In Paris, for example, the morgue used to be the place where people rushed to by tens of thousands after reading about the discovery of a body in the newspapers, because they knew it would be displayed in the window for everyone to see. They may have done this to facilitate identifying the bodies, but most of the people that went did so to see the dead up close. The more gruesome or mysterious a person's death, the more people showed up to see their body. There were also public executions, although in some cases attending was mandatory to deter potential offenders from even acting out. It seems as though when the person to be executed was a criminal, more people would show up. Today, there are a plethora of ways to explore death and all things macabre, from books, television shows, to entire dedicated museums and touristic tours, which some can find very distasteful, and in some cases, rightfully so. But the overall interest in these themes isn't regarded as abnormal. In fact, Émile Durkheim, a French sociologist, the father of sociology as an academic discipline, along with Karl Marx and Max Weber, presented numerous lectures and published works on topics including morality and deviance. He said crime was quote-unquote normal and that deviance was essential to social cohesion. And what he meant was, the fact that people are so fascinated by the killers and not the victims suggests that, as a society, we are shocked by their actions. The tendency to stare at the abnormal is indicative of how ingrained the normal is in our society, and Durkheim saw that as a positive thing. Morbid curiosity specifically has not been very researched as of yet, but there have been some studies, and I've been able to gather a few interesting perspectives on the matter. According to a clinical psychologist, witnessing violence and destruction, no matter in what way, gives us the opportunity to confront our fears of death, pain, despair, etc., while still feeling some level of safety. This sensation is sometimes experienced when we stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, for example, or look through the glass at a lion at a zoo. We ask ourselves questions with an intensity of emotion that is uncoupled from the true reality of the disaster. If I was in that situation, what would I do? How would I respond? Would I be the hero or the villain? Could I endure the pain? Would I have the strength to recover? We play out the different scenarios in our head because it helps us to reconcile that which is uncontrollable with our need to remain in control. It could also be a means to purge oneself of negative emotions like anger. One study published by the American Psychological Association found that we react to and learn more from our negative experiences than we do positive ones. Humans are prone to negative bias and negative potency, explains psychologist Dr. Renee Carr. She adds, negative bias is the tendency to automatically give more attention to a negative event and negative information than positive information or events. Psychologically, negative events activate our brain more than positive ones. Negative potency describes the higher amount of psychological arousal that is experienced when a person is exposed to a negative or traumatic event compared with a positive event. Today, The biggest consumers of horror are mainly young people, and there is a growing passion for the genre amongst children too. What are the consequences? In the 1950s, the question of the emotional impact of certain behaviors on children was already very clear. Albert Bandura introduced the theory of social learning to talk about the interaction between the child's mind and its environment, and how much children learn through observation, imitation, and social environment. Bandura studied in particular the consequences of exposure to violent and aggressive behavior. The results of his research pointed out that most children exposed to the aggressive pattern were more likely to behave aggressively than children who hadn't witnessed such behavior. The incidence was even higher in cases where the aggressive and violent behavior had some sort of positive reinforcement. As for Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Richard Ramirez, the first common denominator here would be that they were relatively good looking. Contrary to the stereotypical expectations of what a serial killer should look like at the time, which we now know that they can look just like anybody else. Ted Bundy in particular was also charismatic and well-spoken. That and the fact that their crimes were so shocking garnered them all the media attention and exposure. The people ate it up, which in turn made the media outlets money, and so more content was made, movies, books, and so on and so forth. And thus started the snowball effect that would bring us to them still being talked about today, even though they all died years ago. And I'm no psychologist by any means here, but if I go by the theories and arguments that we've just now mentioned, when the younger, more impressionable audience gets repeatedly hit with various versions of the same horrible stories, where young attractive actors, whom many of them are already fans of, are cast as the killers, that is when it can potentially become problematic. One can argue that the killers themselves were good looking, and that during their respective trials the media was already glamorizing them, that they had many people of both genders writing them letters, and that to portray them differently would be inaccurate. Although that is somewhat true to an extent, they didn't already have millions of fans each. And I think it's still fair to say that casting former Disney stars to the likes of Zac Efron and Ross Lynch to portray vicious serial killers is not a great look, because it means that they are deliberately targeting their young, impressionable fans. I'm sure you saw that Netflix put out a tweet telling people not to sexualize Ted Bundy. You can't not know that at least some of the young people you deliberately targeted with your casting choices, who just a few years ago were watching Zac in High School Musical or Ross in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, are going to project their infatuation for them onto their characters. Thankfully, most people, young or not, will not, but some will, and some did. It would have been more responsible of them to have casted unknown actors, and preferably not picture-perfect ones either. They could also just have refrained from producing yet more movies and docuseries on the same guys. Although we know profits are a top priority, it would have been less damaging probably, because this resulted in the internet being flooded with mostly young people openly idolizing the killers and blurring the lines between what is and what isn't socially and morally acceptable for themselves and for others, who may be just as impressionable and inclined to follow or even emulate their newfound idols in a very misguided attempt to get attention and notoriety. Young people were not the only ones that could and would fall for these monsters, hence why they received so much fan mail during their jail time. But not just that. Carol Ann Boone conceived a child with Ted Bundy while he was in jail. Doreen Leoy married Richard Ramirez while he was in jail. And Jeffrey Dahmer also received his share of fan mail of both genders, as well as dozens of thousands of dollars, if I'm not mistaken. It is said to be a paraphilia called Hybristophilia, or sexual interest in and attraction to those who commit crimes, also known as the Bonnie and Clyde syndrome. Some speculations have been offered as to the cause of hybristophilia. Catherine Ramsland, a professor of forensic psychology, mentions that some of the women who have married or dated male serial killers have offered these reasons: low self-esteem and lack of father figure for one, belief that they can change them, will to nurture the little boy that they once were, will to share in the media spotlight or get a book or a movie deal. She would know where he is at all times, yet there is no laundry to do, nor cooking for him, nor accountability to him. She can keep the fantasy going for longer. Some mental health experts have compared infatuation with killers to extreme forms of fanaticism. They view such women as insecure females who cannot find love in normal ways, or as love-avoidant females who seek romantic relationships that cannot be consummated. Psychologist Leon F. Seltzer has offered explanations based on evolutionary psychology. Such males were quote-unquote good at protecting women and their offspring according to evolutionary history, when they're not busy killing them. He suggests women today may consciously realize that it is unwise to date a serial killer, but they are nevertheless attracted to them. As for the victims, they are often considered as numbers, almost footnotes in the killer's lives, especially in those serial killer cases where they are numerous. And although some regret that the focus isn't more on the victims, and I can totally understand why they do, I still have a certain reservation on the matter, which you might agree with or you might not, but it is my own, so I'm going to put it out there. Of course, there are many ways one can report on a true crime case. I try to ask myself, what would I think of this statement if I was a member of the victim's family, for example? Which is why I try to avoid the graphic images of the victims for one, and also try to avoid to get into too much detail regarding the victims themselves, their personal lives. I even hesitate to mention them by name sometimes, because I wouldn't want their names everywhere associated with the name of the person who harmed them. I would probably be triggered. This is also why I prefer to cover either very old cases or where they just are very unlikely to come across a video of mine. Another thing is, and that especially goes for people that do it all themselves, the research, the recording, the editing, the more I talk about the victims in details, the more I empathize and identify with them. So when comes the part when I have to report on the gruesome things that inevitably happen to them in these kinds of stories, it hurts that much more. So it's like a buffer for me to stick to the facts and not get too emotionally involved in the case, most of the time at least. I'm like hypersensitive. I'll cry watching a random cartoon, so yeah. But surely Netflix has the resources and the means, provided that the families of the victims involved are okay with that, of course, to create shows in ways that put the victims forward and turn things around. And surely they've done it already. I haven't watched all of their docuseries, but I did watch The Keepers, for example, and I thought it was very good. Of course, since it's an unsolved case, they had no choice other than to focus on the victims, but the fact that it did so well and was even nominated for a TCA award should be enough to demonstrate that they can also create a profitable show that way. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, and let's have a peaceful discussion. If you liked the video, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe for more, and ring that bell to get notified when I upload the next one. In the meantime, check out my Strangest Things playlist for cases that you may not have heard of yet. Have a good one. Bye!